right, welcome back. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the stock Mojave rear shocks and I'm going to make my own dual rate spring, a progressive spring, because what happens is when you're cranking it down like this, you'll see the curvature of this spring, and what happens is when you start to bottom this spring out, you'll end up with coil binding. And when you end up with coil binding, you end up with a bad rear hop of the RC, which could cause it to flip over. That's not what I want, and that's why I changed the spring rate in Mojave on the XLX2 single motor Mojave. And that one rides pretty good, but what I notice is because I've shortened the shock and I've added a stiffer spring, it's limiting my travel. I've adjusted the droop screws to where I don't have much travel up. People were talking about adding fuel tubing to the shock shafts. Well, when you add fuel tubing to the shock shaft, it's basically like a droop screw, but with a little bit of bump. So it's like a, what do you call it? A shock, a control arm bump stop is what it is. So when you hit that, it's not bottoming out and it gives you a little bit of cushion, but it's also limiting how much travel you have. And what I'm finding is if I could find the balance between weight, how much the RC weighs, as you know, this one is heavier, that's 17 pounds. This is going to be, you know, over 20 pounds. What that's going to do is it's going to want to suck down and slap the chassis on the ground sooner. So if I add fuel tubing, that's going to give it a, before the chassis actually hits the ground, it's going to give it a bad kick up. And if I bottom out and then come out of that dip, it's going to want to throw the RC up in the air, which we're noticing with the Cletus wheel Mojave. That's what's going on. When I go from park to park and we hit those bumps, every time you'll see the RC leave the ground. I've got it to where it leaves level, but now we're in the air for a short period of time with those wheels spinning up, and if you don't catch it on rubber tires, what happens is the tires explode. With the Cletus wheels, they're not exploding, but when we land, all that load is kicking back to the ESC, and what I believe is happening is on the XLX2, it's limiting the current going to the motor, and then you have those bad current draws to where you're peaking out what the batteries can supply the ESC, and then it reduces power to the motor. And we're skipping along that grass with the Cletus wheel thing, and it's really limiting how much amps are going to the motor. Long story short, it's just a theory I have. So what I'm doing is on the second build, the twin motor build, I'm actually making a dual rate spring. What it is the first part of the spring is the stock Mojave spring, and now because I've basically put it in here and collapsed it as stiff as it can go, it's going to end up with coil binding. So when you get that coil binding and it doesn't want to move, it's going to take the second rate spring and we're going to ride on a real stiff spring, which is going to be a limitless spring. This is the short spring, this is a front spring on a V1 limitless. So as you see, we're adjusted all the way up, and before this can do coil bind, it's riding on the second part, and look at all that shock, and I'm pushing really hard right now. So this is really stiffened it up with the adjustment all the way up. Now in order to do that, you have to separate the spring. So what's happening is this top spring is bottoming out until it hits this washer I've put in there. And it's not that the spring is pushing down on this spring, the washer is actually bottoming out, and now it's riding on that. So I can play with the first bounce of the spring, and then when it hits the washer, it's now gonna act like an on-road spring and be really stiff. At least that's my theory. And now I can also reverse this. I can flip this around and put the long spring down here and put the short spring up here and do it that way. So I would have to run a bigger washer that works on the thread part here. But I'm going to try this first. I think this is going to work. I've been playing with this for a couple hours now. So I want to show you how I'm doing this to make your own dual rate spring, to where you can have, over those light bumps, you can have that soft Mojave travel like you were cranking up the spring, like the spring was like this, by it being fully extended. And now I can play with that first part by stiffening it up, by adjusting this down. And then if I get to coil bind, instead of the washer hitting the shock and pushing this down, it's now going to take the coil bind and then push this down. So it's going to work two different ways. So over the small bumps, we're going to have plenty of travel. And then when we get to those bigger bumps, it's really going to be stiff, but we're still going to have spring travel. Rather than trying to use fuel tubing to do this, I think this is a better way. So I'm going to show you how I'm setting these things up. Maybe you guys can try it yourself. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't work. That's the whole thing about testing. I'm probably going to do it to front and rear on this RC because this RC weighs so much. I'm trying to keep the weight of me adding weight to this RC. I'm trying to keep from doing that, since there's 4 batteries, 2 motors, 2 ESCs. I really don't want to add a bunch of weight to the front of this thing. I will if I have to, but I'm trying to avoid it, so I'm trying to do it through shock tuning. So all I do is I take the shock all the way up. We're going to go ahead and take our bottom shock perch out. I'm going to remove the spring for now. I have to take off the shock rod end so that I can add a washer in here. Now I have to put the spring on before I add the washer, so I'm going to do that as well. And I showed you guys that I purchased these fender washers. The ones I'm using is a 3/16 by 1. So it's a 3/16 hole by 1 inch diameter. So it's like this. And that's going to stop the spring from coiling up into the other spring and create an issue. So we're going to do this. We're going to add the spring. We're then going to add the washer. Right? Now I got to put on the shock rod end. So I'm going to use the shock tool just to hold that there for now. I'm going to add my shock rod end back. And I got to get my limitless spring out, because we're going to add our limitless spring next. So that's the way you're going to look right here. So now we're going to add the spring, which is going to sit on top of the washer. Collapse everything down, and we're going to go ahead and stick our perch back in. And there we go. Now we got a dual rate spring for the back of the Mojave. Now I'm going to set this thing back on the ground, and we're going to see how stiff this travel is versus the last video on how spongy it was. I've been playing with it for a while. I just decided to kick on the camera once I figured out what I was going to do, because I'm sure you guys don't want to see my mad scientist thinking skill when it comes to trying to build something. I've sat here for hours before trying to figure something out, and then it just, what I come up with just did not work. Oh yeah, way better. Chassis still not on the ground. It's going to accelerate till about that point, and then we're going to go ahead and use that. I think that's awesome right there. God, that's so good. And I can stiffen up, which I might do. That does seem kind of soft. So I'm probably going to stiffen up this first part just a little bit. That might be good. There we go. That's doing pretty good right there. So we got the Mojave ride right there that's cranked up. And then we have the Limitless stiff, and the chassis and wheelie bars not on the ground. So I'm hoping before it gets to that it'll lift. Yeah, see, that's really good right there. That's so stiff. I'm pushing down really hard here. It's not wheeling the front, and it's keeping that rear end from hitting the chassis on the ground. I think that's the ticket, but we won't know until we get out and run it. The front's not bad. See, I don't think the front needs much more. These front springs are a lot less. But when this thing's accelerated, it's accelerating, it's cranked up. And then it's floating over those bumps. So I do need a little bit more tension. So while it's cranked up, I'm gonna go ahead and do the same thing. I think I have two springs somewhere in here. Where's the other spring? There it is. So those two springs, which are softer, which are the rear of Limitless, is what these are. They're a little longer, but the spring tension's a lot softer. So I'm going to use these on the front. I use the front ones on the rear. I think that's going to be the ticket. So I'm going to get the front done, and then I'll show you how that acts. But look how the front is right now. You see how it pretty much bottoms out. Now we are accelerating, so this is floating, but if I can keep the wheels planted instead of floating like this and hitting bumps and it throwing up the tires as easy as this, look how easy that tire is. And the chassis, it's not even moving. See? So that thing's just bouncing like a basketball over the bumps, causing it not to steer right. If I can keep this thing planted on the ground by pushing down on spring tension and hitting bumps and it riding over it, that's going to give me more traction to the back. In my head, that's the way all this stuff is going. So I'm going to go ahead and get that stuff done. We'll be right back. Now I'm on to the front. I got them off the RC car. Now the next thing we can play with is shock fluids to kind of slow down the rebound. That would be, you know, my next step. But before making a shock fluid change, we're going to see how the stock resistance does. So I'm going to kind of do the same thing with this. Take off the shock rod end. The spring, the shock is a little shorter. Just going to clamp that in there, hold it tight so it doesn't push it, so I can get the rod end back on. Now here's the challenge. It's getting this spring in here without coil binding. These springs might be a little too long. Alright, I think I'm going to need a different spring on one of these. Let me think about these fronts real quick. We'll be right back. Alright, so I'm going to show you how I did this. I did use this spring, but it's an old, it's not the best way to do it, but it's an old trick we used to use back in the 80s. People still do it today. Is we're going to take some of the spring tension out of this, and I'm going to show you how I did that. I'm going to shorten this spring. I'm going to take this top layer and we're going to collapse it onto this bottom layer. So like that. We are now going to heat up our spring and we're going to collapse this first part. So I'm going to heat this up. We are going to collapse this spring. Now I'm gonna go submerge this in water. We'll be right back. All right, there we go. That's gonna give us a shorter spring. And then the other thing I'm doing, these are the Mojave perches. We are using the smaller perch that came with these springs that are off the Limitless. Put the spring on, put the washer on. Get our perch back on, our shock rod in, I mean. Now that we got that assembled, I'm going to put our spring. The part I heated up is going to be down. There we go. It's pretty darn stiff. It might be too stiff, but we're going to give it a go. So I'm going to get them put back on. We're going to see how stiff the front of this thing is. We'll be right back. And we'll see how it does. The front is springing up more than I want. See how springy the front is? Not really a lot of travel, but it definitely is springy. Which, it's mainly floating anyway, so I'd rather it float up high rather than the chassis hitting the bumps. So maybe that'll be enough. That's all the spring tension taken out of it for now. And we'll see how that does. The other thing I can do is I can crank down on these shocks to push these other springs farther down to give us a softer ride, so that we ride mainly on this top spring rather than just riding on the bottom spring. But the back is really soft compared to how stiff the front is. But we'll give it a go. Hopefully this won't cause the front to keep throwing itself up, but we'll see once I get the batteries in. And remember, I still can add weight to the front of this to try to keep it down, but we'll see how it does. I honestly think I'm gonna have to play with the shocks on the front. I think I might go to the long travel shocks that are on the rear, maybe on the front. We'll see. I know these shock shafts are a little shorter, because the shock tower up front I think is a little shorter than the rear. It's definitely too really bouncy in the front of this RC. The rear I think is good. I think the front, I might just have to go to the original spring again. That might be enough. I think that might be too bouncy, but we'll give it a shot. There we go. Like, comment, subscribe. We'll catch you on the next video. Yeah. Ooh.